Welcome to the comfy zone. Make yourself at home.
I think I got scammed, and it almost killed me. The listing said private cabin retreat, not another living soul around for miles. I guess technically it wasn't wrong. Yes, there were plenty of red flags, but this was my first vacation by myself, so I thought I was just being overly paranoid. The drive up was quiet and uneventful, but I got there much later than I'd hoped. It was nearly dusk as I pulled into the long and winding dirt road leading to the cabin. The entryway was shrouded in tall trees, and for a moment, I thought I saw someone watching me from just behind the tree line. But I looked back and there was no one there. I told myself I must have imagined it. I'd just seen one of the shifting shadows from the setting sun among the heavy foliage. When I'd first entered the address into my navigation app, I was disappointed to see the address was for a campground. The host had apparently cropped the image on the listing to make it look like a lone cabin. I wasn't all that surprised, though. The place was ridiculously cheap, and one of the few rentals in the area that were available at the time. After the figure I thought I'd seen on the drive up, plus the way the trees nearly choked out what was left of the sun, I wasn't upset at the idea of not being totally alone. I double-checked the instructions I'd printed to find the combination to the lockbox and the notes, some of which were a bit odd. You may not check out early. Pool open to guests. There are great hiking trails in the woods. Enjoy your stay. Please take the trash out before you leave. The pool is open to guests. From the middle of the camp there was an ancient-looking paved trail, cracked and uneven, that wound around the perimeter through the dense trees. The area itself was beautiful, but as I walked along, I passed cabin after cabin in varying states of disrepair. Some had warped wood and caved-in roofs. Others had missing doors and rotted steps. One was nothing but the remains of a foundation. There had been other cars in the parking lot, but it was eerily quiet. There wasn't another guest in sight. The absence of any living person was a presence in itself that loomed over the whole place. It didn't feel peaceful at all. It was unnerving. I'd wondered if I had stumbled upon an old listing somehow, though they had certainly accepted my reservation and money. I was about to turn back when I spotted it in the distance, the cabin from the pictures. It looked well cared for, unlike the others. I saw movement from the corner of my eye and jumped, already on edge. After a moment I realized what it was. The remnants of a torn curtain fluttering along with the breeze through the busted-out window of the cabin next door. All of the other cabins looked to be vacant, the darkness within apparent through blank and shattered windows. I felt an awful, creeping apprehension, and I strongly debated just leaving, but it was almost dark out and I didn't feel comfortable driving through dark woods at night, especially with nowhere else to stay. I figured I'd head out in the morning. A bit further down from my cabin, I could see an old pool that I doubt had seen a swimmer in decades. Worn-out-looking children's toys, shoes, trash, and other debris from the campsite littered the bottom of the deep end, sun-bleached and long forgotten. A wide and streaky rust-colored stain painted one of the walls and bottom of the cracking plaster, ending at the pile of abandoned items. I thought of the pool open to guests note from the host. I guess they had a weird sense of humor. Other than the screech of rusted hinges when I opened the door, the cabin was in good condition, although the decor looked to have last been updated in the 1970s. While looking around for a bit, I found a few dust-covered items that looked to be accidentally left behind by the previous guest, and made a mental note to let the host know. I sat inside for a while, looking out at the grounds and woods around me. For a moment, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw the pool filled with dark water, multiple pale and thin figures standing in it up to their shoulders. But when I turned to look, it was empty, just like it had always been. I assured myself I was just imagining things. The solitude was even more apparent after the sun had fully set, far removed from the lights of the nearest town, and with the moon drowned out by clouds. The campsite was blanketed in a level of darkness unlike anything I had ever experienced before. That, coupled with the silence, made me feel completely alone in the world. The only sounds I'd occasionally hear were the wind through the leaves and the occasional soft slosh of moving water. I decided to call a friend just to hear another human voice, but I had no reception on my phone, and the old rotary phone in the kitchen didn't work. I didn't even get a dial tone. Already regretting my decision to stay, I turned in early, hoping the night would pass quickly. I wondered if they'd give me a refund on the other 2 nights, but based on their note about not checking out early, figured probably not. I had almost fallen asleep when I heard it. The tap, 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 and scraping against the window. It didn't concern me at first. I assumed the wind had picked up and I was hearing one of the many trees surrounding the cabin. But then, I heard the protest of the metal hinges of the front door. I bolted upright. I must have forgotten to lock it behind me. The old wooden floorboards of the kitchen creaked under the weight of whomever had come inside. I locked the bedroom door and grabbed my phone, only to remember that I had no service. Unsure of what else to do, I pushed the only other piece of furniture in the room in front of the door and wedged myself under the bed. Their steps sounded wet, and made an awful squelching sound on the carpet in the hallway. The sound of their footsteps became louder, closer. The intruder paused. A door opened further down the hall, one of the other bedrooms. Another set of footsteps continued on, even after the first had paused. There were more than one of them. Methodically, slowly, I heard someone enter each room, walk around it, leave. They were working their way down the hall, closer and closer to the room I was in. I really thought I was experiencing what were to be my final moments on this earth. Tap, tap, tap. That time it came from my bedroom door, and in the closer proximity I could hear the scrape of long nails on the rough wood. They turned the handle and I held my breath, hoping the flimsy-looking lock would hold. When it didn't open, they alternated between tapping at the door and slamming against it. I heard the slow and deliberate steps of one of them leaving, and not long after, the tapping on the window resumed. Sometimes I'd hear the painfully shrill sound of something sharp being dragged along the glass. I spent every moment of that night wide awake, with my heart pounding in time with the taps at the door and windows. It was nearly dawn when I finally heard the last pair of footsteps fade into the distance, the front door open and close for the last time. I waited another couple of hours for the sun to be high above the horizon before I felt brave enough to open the bedroom door. I somewhat expected someone to be out there, quietly and patiently waiting for me. But there was nothing to indicate there had ever been anyone there at all, except for the dried, muddy footprints all over the wood floors and the still damp carpet. I gathered my things as fast as I could. Outside, I could see where the prints continued. They circled my car multiple times, made trips to and from the bedroom window. I saw that they originated from and ended at the long, dry pool, into which they disappeared. I noticed something else odd about the prints. They were misshapen. They looked to be made by bare feet, but the proportions were off. The image they suggested resembled no feet I had ever seen before. I loaded everything back in the car as fast as I could. I didn't even look back in my rear-view mirror. As soon as I felt safe and had reception, I went to message the host, both to ask for a refund and to let them know what happened. They never responded to me. I decided to contact the company, but noticed that the listing had been removed. Not long after, though, it was back up again. I filed a complaint, but it took a month for it to get taken down. I'm still not sure it'll show back up again. I wanted to share my experience, to encourage people to make better decisions than I did. If things don't feel right, please, don't ignore the red flags. And if you see this listing, do not book it.
Welcome to the comfy zone. Make yourself at home.
While waiting in line at the store for a self-checkout terminal, a man casually sidled up to me and asked if I'd mind lending him a few dollars. as he was short on cash. I glanced at his handbasket, saw that he only had a few items: some fruit, bottled water, packs of tuna, a loaf of bread, and offered to just pay for his groceries, seeing as how the cost wouldn't be more than $10 or $15. I hadn't put much in my cart, so our combined totals wouldn't break the bank. He looked at me as if I'd offered him my kidney, his eyes watering and lip quivering. Before he could say anything, I told him that it'd be all right, that I wouldn't mind at all, and nudged my cart over so he could deposit his items. He gave a heartful smile, nodded his head, and added his items to the cart. The line cleared. I paid for what we'd gathered, and gave him his items. As gratefully as he could, he thanked me and shook my hand, and we parted ways. I went home with that little warm feeling in my chest that arises after you've done a nice thing for someone, and hoped that he'd pass on the gesture to someone else. Well, he did, just not in a way I would have ever expected. The following day, I went back to the same store to grab a drink and snack, about the same time I'd gone the day before, and mildly surprising, the same man was also there. Again, his handheld basket carried the same few items. He saw me, our eyes met, and for a moment I thought, oh boy, I hope he isn't some kind of grifter, getting strangers to buy him things every day. But then he smiled and pointed at the drink and chips in my hand, gesturing for me to put them in his basket. I complied, thanking him and sharing a laugh at the coincidental nature of it all. He gave me my things, and we parted ways again, having developed a little grocery store friendship. I saw him again 3 days later, at the same store, at the same time. Again, he carried a basket with only a few items, those single-serve packs of tuna, some fruit, a loaf of bread, and a couple bottles of water. Something about the regularity of our meeting and his seemingly unchanging diet unnerved me. Despite the man's completely harmless appearance and outward nature, I nonetheless felt there was something off about him. But I didn't want to sour the little acquaintanceship we'd developed, so I waved and politely asked about his Spartan diet. He laughed and replied that they were the items he went through most often, assuring me that his palate wasn't so limited. I remarked that I'd have no room to criticize, considering my own relatively simple tastes. Thinking the interaction over, I said, "See you later," and went over to the next available self-checkout terminal. As I finished scanning my last item and prepared to pay, he came up beside me, resting his basket on the counter. He locked eyes with me and said, "Have you forgotten? It's your turn to cover things." I was taken aback, since I'd never once thought that it'd be a regular thing, us paying for each other's items every time we happened to meet. But not wanting to make a scene and having enough money to cover everything, I complied, even sheepishly apologizing for having forgotten. His ever-present smile broadened, and he nodded in thanks. He took his portion of the bags and departed, leaving me more than a little disturbed. Still, nothing actually hostile had happened, so I didn't make a fuss about it to the staff, who I'm sure hadn't even noticed our odd exchange. At that moment, I did decide to never again visit the store at the same time, just so I wouldn't have to deal with him again. I couldn't cover his purchases forever. A few days later, I was back at the store, only I'd gone before work, at 7 a.m. when the store first opened. I was the first one in and felt a huge relief at seeing the self-checkout completely clear when I had gathered what I needed. But just as I was about to hit Pay Now on the touchscreen, a hand stopped mine. Turning, I saw him, standing there with a smile on his face, and his same peculiar assortment of items in his cart. Utterly shocked, I just stood there. Using his needlessly solid grip on my hand, he lightly pushed me aside. He proceeded to quietly scan his own items, then selected Pay Now and inserted his money. Despite the charitable gesture, there was an almost palpable aura of malice about him, as if the kind act was somehow subtly unkind. It honestly freaked me out, and I would have just left, abandoning the roughly $45 in groceries, if he hadn't been holding on to my hand. But then the machine spat out the receipt, he deposited it into one of my bags, and released his grip. I didn't even bother thanking him. I just grabbed my stuff and headed toward the front. But before I could exit, he called out, "Remember, next one's on you." I didn't respond and practically ran to my car. For the next round of groceries a week later, I went to a completely different store on the other side of town. Still, there was a feeling of trepidation as I gathered my items. Pushing my cart carefully, peeking around the corners, hoping not to spot him. I even avoided the aisles that held the items he'd consistently purchased, dreading to see him browsing the shelves. Finally ready to pay and leave, I walked toward the self-checkout as a death row inmate might walk to the chair, each step carrying a grim weight. My fears and anxiety were confirmed. Even though I hadn't seen him anywhere in the store, he was there, waiting behind an old woman who was doubtlessly oblivious to the man's almost logic-defying presence. I hadn't made a sound in my approach, but he still turned around as if sensing me. He smiled and raised his basket, and there were the same usual items inside. A register opened, and he nodded toward it, motioning for me to go ahead. And as if being led to some terrible fate by unyielding hands, I went to the register. But even though I'd followed his order, I swore to myself then and there that I wouldn't pay for his items. I began scanning my things, all the while sensing his gaze, knowing he was waiting for me to finish before coming over to add his own. When the last item was scanned, I carefully retrieved my card from my wallet, not wanting to show this man how utterly terrified I was. And, as expected, he came over and began unloading his basket onto the counter. With enough force to stop them, but not enough to draw attention, I put my hand down and whispered, "No." It took a mad fight against my nerves, but I managed to look up and meet his gaze, and for the first time I noticed how off his eyes were. Not necessarily in their alignment on his face, but the way they stared, the smoldering intensity behind an otherwise normal pedestrian appearance. It was the expression of someone who had been born unhinged and had only adapted to normal, sane society, rather than someone sane who had slowly cracked under some great stress or pressure. Somehow, my resolve held, and I didn't back down from that face of carefully contained lunacy. He smiled and, to my complete surprise, began returning his items to his basket. Not wasting the opportunity to escape, I inserted my card, paid, and gathered my bags. Risking a look back, I saw him talking to another man, whom, after inclining his head to listen, shrugged his shoulders and nodded. My unhinged acquaintance then put his items in the man's cart, and together they headed to the register I had just left. A sense of duty to my fellow man compelled me to warn the guy, even at some unknown risk to my own person. I started to head over, but someone grabbed my arm at the last moment. It was a woman, someone I'd never seen before. She looked utterly depressed, her hair disheveled, her eyes sunken, her cheeks hollow as if she'd had some buccal fat removal operation. Quietly, she pulled me aside. "Don't. You have a day, maybe two. What you have in your cart there, can you live off that for a week?" I looked down, automatically assessing the contents, even as I shuddered at the urgency in her voice. I'd spent about $75, which I knew wouldn't last me very long these days. I met her gaze, and she must have seen the doubt on my face, because she pulled me closer and said, "It doesn't matter. Just eat as conservatively as you can. That man over there, the one you've presumably been bumping into here, or at other stores, he's psychotic. And that's if he's even human. He's gotten the same stuff every time, right? Tuna, fruit, some water, bread. Never deviating from that. How do I know? Because that's what I sent my husband out to get 6 months ago. He had told me how he bumped into this stranger who'd asked him if he could pay for something, a dictionary and a book of maps. My husband complied, figuring the man to be homeless or something like that. My husband had had those items in his cart, the tuna, water, fruit, and bread, at the time. He said that they parted ways on friendly terms, but that the man had seemed off, strange in an undefinable way. Well, he saw him again the next day, grabbing some other things we needed. This time the stranger had a cart, and the same items my husband had bought the day before were in there. The stranger paid for my husband's items, being just as friendly as he'd been before, but then they met again, and I'm sure you can guess what items were in the man's basket. There was a certain mania in her eyes, though one that was obviously born of long-held anxiety, if not full-blown terror. She wasn't crazy, not like him. She had experienced something awful, and hadn't been able to truly express herself to someone until meeting me. Hearing the ding of items being scanned at a leisurely pace behind me, I told her to continue. Finally, my husband said no, that he wouldn't pay for the man's items anymore, that he had grown uncomfortable with the whole affair. He said that the man didn't seem to be offended and allowed my husband to finish checking out unbothered. My husband came home, told me about what had happened, and we had a little laugh at the absurdity of it all. And then the next day, I came home from work to find several grocery bags on the kitchen table. We hadn't needed groceries. He'd stocked up the last time, presumably so he wouldn't have to deal with the man for a while. So I was understandably upset by how much he'd spent. But before I could even call out to him, I saw the puddle beneath the table. It was bright red and still expanding via a steady stream of crimson from the table's surface. The inner animal part of me understood at once, but still I continued forward, my conscious mind unbelieving, unable to accept that anything so monstrous could happen in our civilized society. I opened the bag nearest the edge of the table and saw my husband's face staring up at me, pale and lifeless. He'd been savagely dismembered and bagged. I immediately knew who the culprit was, called the police when I managed to recover. But they didn't do much. Couldn't. The man's face was mysteriously blurred in the store's security footage. There'd never been a clear shot of him. Eventually I mustered the courage to wait around the store and eventually saw him. Tracked him. I've tried pointing him out, but his face is never clear. And the police refused to take any action, not wanting to risk causing trouble for some random person. Afraid to be sued, I guess. I know they think I'm crazy, but you don't, right? You've been through it. You know what he's like. It's why I'm telling you to leave here, to go as far away as you can. My husband may have been the first, but you aren't the second. I've watched him do this to others. I've tried to warn them. I hope that they've listened. I'd approach the man myself, confront him in front of everyone, but I'm scared. You can't blame me, can you? After what he did to my husband, I can't fight him. I won't try to. But I can warn others, even if it means driving every store in town out of business or making a fool of myself to strangers. With a final tearful smile, she ushered me ahead of her. I glanced back, saw the allegedly murderous stranger shaking hands with his latest friend, and hurried out the door. I hope the woman manages to convincingly warn him before it's too late.
Welcome to the comfy zone. Make yourself at home.
I always saw Marilyn walking 3 huge dogs in the park. She was a little 5'1" woman, walking these giant Burmese mountain dogs and handling it with ease. I was in love, even though I didn't know a single thing about her. I worked up the courage to talk to her. She was nice, but hesitant. She seemed like an exceptionally wary person. I was patient and earned her trust. I slowly discovered she was everything I had built her up to be in my head, and then some. We dated for months without her ever inviting me to her place. She always said she lived at the edge of town and hated it, but it was odd and unnerving. I spent a lot of my time wondering what the issue was. Was she married or a hoarder? We were 6 months in and had too many drinks when I confronted her on never inviting me over. I wasn't taking no for an answer. She had to bring me over, or I was breaking up with her. Marilyn brought me home. She wasn't married, She wasn't a hoarder. She did live on the other edge of town in a little house filled with her giant dogs. Nothing was out of the ordinary. Things didn't stay that way. Marilyn's dogs behaved strangely. They would start barking or growling at random spots in corners of the house, as if there was an intruder. This also got worse in the middle of the night. The dogs constantly got up around 3 a.m., barking and going crazy, and sniffing all around the room while we slept. I think I knew what scent they were picking up on. It was a male scent, musty cigarettes, sweat, and the sting of men's deodorant trying to cover it all up. It was so strong, I was getting ready to confront Marilyn on it. Did she have a man who was staying there when I wasn't there? The power of the smell was undeniable, as was a strong presence of someone else in the house. I asked Marilyn about it. She was very matter-of-fact. She was haunted by a male spirit. It always lingered. She didn't think it was dangerous, but it was scary, and it wasn't the house. It was her. It had been with her for a couple years now, and different locations. She asked if it was a deal-breaker. No, I was all in. I loved her. I could deal with ghosts. I could deal with feeling like I was always being watched. I could deal with never feeling alone. I wasn't prepared to deal with what the actual reality was, though. We spent time at Marilyn's place. Those supernatural oddities always lingered. She explained she got the 3 giant dogs to protect her from whatever it was. Everything had become kind of second nature to me until one day when we walked into the house and Marilyn peeped right back out the living room blinds. "I keep seeing the same middle-aged woman everywhere I go," Marilyn whispered. I had no idea at the time that sentence was the opening line to a horror movie the two of us were about to live. "She's plain, always wearing a hat, sunglasses, super small, and always driving a white car, a Honda," Marilyn went on. I knew the car. I had seen it several times in the past few months. I also could picture a woman, hat, sunglasses, small. She always seemed to be around like an extra in a movie about my life. It was my time to admit something to Marilyn. I'd had a stalker, and apparently she was back. I dated a girl named Savannah for nearly a year in my early 20s. She came off as just sweet at first, obsessed with me in the right way. Then it became the wrong way. I'll spare too much detail, but I at one point found out that she was secretly recording almost everything we did in her apartment, and she collected random things of mine. Loose hairs, keeping socks and underwear, even nail clippings. She also seemed to be developing an inability to be away from me for any period of time. She was showing up at my office every day, making me go to long lunches. A couple times I was just running errands, and I thought she was following me in her car. It was too much. We had only been together for a few months. I broke it off. Savannah didn't take it well. She kept calling and texting me nonstop, kept showing up at my office, my house. She wouldn't take no for an answer. I eventually threatened a restraining order and pressing charges. She was in medical school and wanted to become a doctor. She knew that kind of thing could really affect her career. She finally relented. I remained connected to Savannah on social media. It appeared she moved to another state, got a boyfriend, and eventually married. I mostly forgot about her. She was definitely the middle-aged woman who was following us, though. Her build, the way she moved, it was all her. I just had never thought it was possible. She was also clearly trying to make herself look older and more plain than she really was. A distant friend of mine I hadn't talked to in years was still connected to her through his girlfriend. I hit him up to see if he knew what the deal was. My friend provided anything but comforting information about Savannah. She hadn't moved out of the state. She wasn't married. She didn't have kids. As far as he knew, she still lived in the area with her parents, had dropped out of med school, and was a recluse. He also didn't think she had social media. I did some investigating. The social media accounts of Savannah's I was still connected to were flimsy, barely any friends or followers or content. I did some research of people I knew she was actually related to, and it looked like the man in her life was actually her sister's husband, and the kids, her niece and nephew. She may have been maintaining them just to throw me off. It also started to click with me. I had seen that white car a lot, even before I was with Marilyn. I had also seen a plain, middle-aged woman with long black hair that I now thought looked like a wig, always wearing a ton of clothes, even in the summer. I just never thought to think anything of it. I was sure Savannah had probably been stalking me all along. It probably never stopped. She was probably just turning up the heat since she saw me get serious with Marilyn. Feeling her grip slip away. I was going to follow through with the restraining order this time and pursue pushing Savannah away for the full extent of the law. Only problem was, I had to prove it was her and she was doing it. Restraining orders are a lot harder to set up than you might think. I was always on the lookout for Savannah with my hand in my pocket, ready to whip out my phone to take a photo or video. But it was like she knew. I never saw her or her white car again. The only problem was the haunting and the agitation of Marilyn's dogs in her house got more and more intense. It seemed to be all hours of the day now, and more jarring. The dogs getting full-on angry. The presence in her house slamming and locking doors. It got so intense, we started setting up cameras around the house to try and capture something. It didn't work until one of them fell behind the couch and accidentally got aimed at the backyard for a day and night. The first video alert hit me during the day while I was at work. A neighborhood kid walked through the yard, nothing sinister. It was so harmless I didn't even remember to move the camera when I got home. The next time I woke up to a ring notification in the middle of the night. I checked the camera and saw the neighborhood kid again, in the backyard again, but this time moving towards the back door. I was no longer just writing this off as an innocent neighborhood teenage boys will be boys moment. I shot out of bed, ran out of the bedroom, and took to the living room flanked by all 3 dogs. I was startled by what waited for me inside the living room, not outside. A tall young man faced the doorway, the image of his broad back, cloaked in a t-shirt, flashing before my eyes for a second before he was gone. The dogs weren't bothered by the flash of a presence of the man. They ran right for the door and kept erupting with barking. I checked the Ring app. I saw the kid walking out the backyard and disappearing into the darkness. I breathed a sigh of relief and tried to calm the dogs. Then I heard Marilyn scream from the bedroom. I rushed to the bedroom and found Marilyn standing next to the bed and looking over at the window in horror. It was the middle of summer and we were fighting the heat, sleeping with the windows open. I could visibly see the screen had been cut and the blinds in front of the window were swaying on a windless night. "Someone tried to grab me," Marilyn whispered to me, staring at the darkness of the window. A thought came over me at that moment just before I started to comfort Marilyn. I wasn't so sure it was a neighborhood boy who terrorized us that night. The size, the movements on the Ring camera, it all added up to Savannah, but dressed as a teenage boy. I took the footage to the police and tried to get that restraining order on Savannah. They said it couldn't be proved it was her in the videos. It was a failure, but it didn't matter, because it all stopped. The appearances of Savannah and the haunting. Marilyn and I, and the dogs, were finally able to rest easy. We settled into life at her house. We made it a year with everything going perfectly. We fell full into love. I proposed. She said yes. I moved into her place. We slept with her giant dogs every night, safe and happy. Then the haunting started to pick up again. It was intense. We would be lying in bed and hear someone walking out in the hallway, or we would be in the bathroom and suddenly see a man standing behind us in the mirror. I had to learn to live with it, though. I loved her, and it just was what it was. I hoped it would get better. Something else unfortunate started to happen after the haunting got bad for a while, though. Savannah was back. It took a while to see it because she was changing vehicles so much and changing her looks. She had gained a ton of weight and wore shoes which made her look taller. We went back to the process of trying to capture her in photos and videos, but again, she seemed to know when we were onto her and disappeared. There was another calm for a few weeks. It didn't feel the way the one did before, though. It felt more like the eye of a storm. It came at night again, the haunting. Marilyn and I were asleep in the middle of the night. All of the lights and electronics in our bedroom flashed on. We woke right up. I saw the split-second image of the silhouette of the man by the bedroom door. It was such second nature to me at this point I didn't even bat an eye. It was different this time, though. The image of the man lingered, and I finally really got a look at him. He was young, probably around 20. Dark hair, dark features, tall, thin, and a little rugged. I heard Marilyn whimper and looked over to her. She was crying as she looked at the young man. Then my attention was drawn to the door as it opened slowly. I held my breath and saw a shadow step just inside the room. I saw the sight of a gun emerge from around the corner. I froze like a deer in the headlights. Whoever was aiming that gun at Marilyn and I had a wide open shot. I could sense they were about to pull the trigger. I closed my eyes. In that little moment of darkness, I heard a scuffle break out. I opened my eyes and saw the male figure wrestling in the doorway with whoever had the gun, and the male figure was winning, forcing them out of the room. I don't know what came over me, but I rushed in that direction, leaving Marilyn and the dogs, still frozen behind me. I was out in the hallway and watching the person with the gun get chased out of the house. I followed them into the living room where I saw a window broken out. For another time, I was able to recognize who was terrorizing us. I could see her small, frail frame, trying to fight off this powerful spirit of a young man. There was no denying it was Savannah with the gun. I saw Savannah on the ground, trying to fight off the spirit and struggling. For a second, I kind of felt sorry for her, down there on the ground, tiny and hurt and insane. I doubt stalking us and getting pummeled by a ghost was what she had always wanted in life. She was simply sick. Those thoughts were running through my head when I watched Savannah slip away from the spirit and rush out the window. I had a feeling I was never going to actually see her again this time. I also had a feeling about that with the spirit of the young man as well. I looked at his back as I heard Savannah run away into the night out the broken window. The spirit of the young man turned to me for a brief second. I saw a sense of relief on his face for a moment. I felt someone approach me from behind. I was startled at first and turned around to see Marilyn and the dogs walking into the living room. The spirit of the young man finally turned around. I watched him meet Marilyn's gaze. The two of them held eyes for a very long time. Everyone silent. Tears gushed out of Marilyn's eyes now. I watched the spirit of the young man nod to her. I watched and heard Marilyn start to break down. I looked over again, and the spirit of the young man was gone. Then I went to comfort Marilyn. I had connected some dots before Marilyn even started mapping them out to me. The spirit which had been hovering around us and haunting us was of her older brother Casey. Casey died in a snowboarding accident years before, shattering Marilyn's young life. Her brother had been her hero and protector, and he was gone suddenly when she was in her vulnerable teenage years. Casey had always told Marilyn he would be there for her. She thought he was actually ramping up his presence and haunting when he knew Savannah was hovering and coming for us. Casey pushing himself back into our world to protect her. The whole thing actually made Marilyn feel good. It gave her some comfort and resolution with Casey. What happened with Savannah was not comforting. We had a ton of video evidence of her, and the police were finally okay with moving forward with several charges. Only problem was the police couldn't find Savannah. She had moved out of her parents' house weeks before, and no one had any contact with her. Marilyn and I weren't as scared as we could have been, though. We had a feeling someone would protect us.